Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, we're going to be talking about inspirational romance and its intersection with American evangelical Christianity. This video is part 2 of a series that I'm doing talking about different elements of deconstructing from evangelical Christianity as integrated book reviews, where I'm using a book as the centerpiece for the topical discussion. If you missed the first video in the series, I will link it up above. This is talking about American evangelical Christianity and patriarchy. But today we're going to be talking about inspirational romance. And this is going to be a long one, so settle in. I actually have notes and an outline. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be primarily drawing on this text. It's called Romance and God, Evangelical Women and Inspirational Fiction by Lynn S. Neal. This book did come out in 2006, so it is a little bit out of date, but for the purposes of what I want to talk about in this video, which is connected to my own experiences with inspirational romance, it is right on target since I came of age in the late 90s and early aughts, and that is a good chunk of the period that this book is covering. This is an academic text. It is an ethnography of evangelical women who read inspirational romances, and it's very well executed. I will say that this author does her best to stay quite neutral and give readers the benefit of the doubt, but my discussion of what she talks about in this book is going to be a little bit more pointed. Hi guys, I am popping in to let you know that I will not be covering everything about inspirational romance in this video because it took me like over an hour to get through half of my notes, and my kids are now home and I have to stop filming. So we're going to divide this up into 2 sections. So here's what you're going to be getting in part 1. In part 1, we are going to define inspirational romance. We're going to talk about the history of inspirational romance and what are some of the things that differentiate it from secular romance. You're going to hear me hint at some of the things that will be coming in part 2, where I'll be giving you case studies of particular books where we can unpack some of this stuff, where I'll be talking more about this concept of sacred romance and some of the toxic ways that I think that this genre can contribute to unhealthy relationships and unhealthy ideas about gender and sexuality. So all of that will be coming. You're going to get a little bit of it in this, but we're going to have to do a part 2 just because, wow, I didn't expect there to be so much to say. The other thing that is covered in this video, which I think is really interesting, is the difference between white evangelical women readers of the genre and Black evangelical women readers of the genre, because as it turns out, they are quite different, and that ends up becoming important as well. So it will not take me too long to do part 2 of this inspirational romance video. I do already have all of my notes. I just ran out of filming time, and this is already going to be really long, so we're breaking it up into parts. I will be periodically quoting from this text. So let's start with some definitions. What is inspirational romance? According to Neal, inspirational or evangelical romance novels take the basic plot structure that you would find in any typical romance genre book and then overlay it with the fundamentals of conservative Christian faith. According to Neal, in these fictional worlds, the obstacles that keep hero and heroine apart emerge from their religious beliefs or lack thereof. So sometimes this might be that one of them is a Christian and the other is not, and the obstacle for them being together is the need for conversion. There might be other obstacles in their way as well, but they tend to be more rooted in faith and in the need for spiritual development or spiritual growth. Neal goes on to say that many evangelical romances do feature the necessity of conversion, while others feature a already Christian hero and heroine learning how to address religious problems and conflicts. These problems, whether one's attitude or a family crisis, represent symptoms of a deeper spiritual malaise. The cure in these fictional worlds necessitates a religious action, such as conversion, forgiveness, or obedience. Whether historical narratives or contemporary renderings, evangelical romances place one's relationship with God before all other relationships, and this in turn becomes the necessary foundation for a successful heterosexual relationship. And I'm going to mention this again, but it is worth noting that in all cases these are heterosexual relationships, and this type of romance is very much heteronormative. As far as the project of this book, Romancing God, she says that this is meant to be a study of evangelical women's devotional lives, of the ways that romantic fiction both configures and reflects their daily practice of religion. Evangelical romance reading emerges from and leads back to the evangelical subculture. However, at the same time, women's reading narratives reveal the negotiations, inconsistencies, and disjunctures of evangelical living. Amid doubts and uncertainties, evangelical romance reading sutures the gaps that appear as the fabric of a world wears thin. These stories are used in a repetitious manner to create sense-making, to help women understand their place in the world, to help them reconnect to a sense of faith or closeness to God, and we're going to talk about all of this, and it also helps to reinforce their own beliefs about gender roles, about morality, about the world around them, and their place in it. And while Neil stays pretty neutral on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, I would argue that there are some definite problems that come along with it. Supposedly, these romance novels that have a Christian foundation and worldview provide a wonderful opportunity for sharing biblical truths about love, both human and divine, relationships, family, and the necessity for a person to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. They're intended to have clear Christian content and are viewed as devotional or some kind of a ministry in some way. And this does become very interesting in patriarchal evangelical Christianity, where in many cases women don't have access to the pulpit, to teaching or preaching. And we talk a lot more about those specific aspects of it in the previous video, so go check that out if you want to hear more. But what becomes interesting with these romance novels is it ends up becoming a platform for some of these authors to, in their own way, minister to the women around them and spread their own views of theology and God and do work that is denied them in a more formal capacity. We're going to move into talking about some more specifics, but I do want to remind you that this book was written in 2006, and so the data and statistics that are going to be mentioned about the identity of the women reading these are from that time period and are not necessarily up to date. And in terms of the scope of what this video is talking about, it is primarily going to be addressing the history of this genre of romance. It's not really a subgenre I read in now, and I don't know enough about it to be able to speak broadly to the current state of inspirational romance as a genre, although there are a couple of points I want to make with regards to that specifically at a later point. But for the most part, this video is going to be focused on the history of inspirational romance and what it means, what it did, the impact that it had on readers like myself who were reading it in the midst of coming of age in purity culture and evangelical Christianities in the late 90s and early aughts. So one thing that I think is really interesting to take a look at is who was the average woman who was reading these novels. They were clearly targeted at women, and I will say primarily this book does talk about white women. There are some exceptions. She also did some interviews with Black women who read in the genre, but they are a very different group than the white women, which I think is interesting. So we're going to talk about that in a minute as well, because I think delineating those differences also will help us understand how we've arrived where we are currently. But in general, the average reader of these was 43 years old, white, female, married with at least one child, a college education, and an annual income between $50,000 and $75,000 a year. And again, this was in 2006. So we're talking primarily white, middle-class, middle-aged women who are married with children. That was the most average reader, but obviously there was a wide spread. I was reading these as a white woman teenager, and I think the fact that these books weren't necessarily written for teenagers, with some exceptions, but were often being read by them, ends up doing some things that I think was maybe not anticipated and not covered by the scope of this study. Looking more broadly at Christian retailing during this period and who was buying Christian books is pretty interesting demographically. Women between the ages of 25 and 54 comprised 75% of Christian bookstore customers. So that was heavily who was purchasing these books from Christian bookstores. In addition, these women were usually white, married, attended church at least once a week, and half of them had an income between $20,000 and $40,000 a year. For these women, Christian products, including evangelical romance novels, provide a way to bolster their faith, a way to cultivate Christianity in all areas of their lives. So these are a lot of the women we're talking about, although, as I mentioned, there were also Black women starting to read in this genre, and there were novels specifically being written in the subgenre for Black women that were often quite different. And also what we learn about what these women were like was quite different. So I want to take a minute to talk about the Black women that she talked to for this study because I think it's really fascinating. Something she said that was interesting is the genre's commitment to religio-romantic triumph may explain in part the racial divide that characterizes the genre's authorship and readership. Evangelical romance, as well as evangelical popular culture as a whole, is predominantly white, and that was certainly the case then. And even today, evangelical culture is very much divided along racial lines in America. Not surprisingly then, many of the African American churches I called and African American women I talked with did not know that evangelical romances existed. However, for many of those African American women who do frequent the Christian bookstore, the genre's emphasis on success and triumph, as well as its covers featuring white heroes and heroines, may simply be too unrealistic and too divergent from their experiences. That said, during this time period, publishers were challenging the racial homogeneity of the genre by actively recruiting minority authors. She interviewed 3 African American authors. They had never heard of Christian fiction and ended up becoming part of the industry this way. One who she talks about at length is Sharon Foster, and she said, "I always loved writing, but I didn't really know anything about Christian fiction," which changed when she saw an advertisement seeking Christian romances featuring minority characters, and she ended up writing them. This did start bringing some African American women to the genre, and in fact, some of the women she interviewed said that they were only interested in reading these books if they were by Black authors. Some of them didn't want to read these books if they were by white authors, which again makes sense if the ideas and experiences being depicted were so different from their own. And this ties into something that we're going to talk about later with some of the problems with how a lot of these romances promote this hyper-individualistic type of religious experience and almost romantic religious experience, which can really ring false when you start to take a bigger look at the world and at people who don't come from a privileged background. Again, we're going to touch on that. The author ended up finding a African American book club that did meet regularly to read some of these romances. She interviewed them, and that's a lot of where this information came from. She didn't find almost any instances of interracial reading. It was pretty racially divided. One thing that's interesting is that the Black women were the only ones who had created a formalized structure for a book club. And we're going to get into a little bit of this later, but it is quite striking to me the differences between these white women who often felt guilty for taking time to read for themselves, felt like they always had to be productive, always had to be active, and that this was just like a silly thing that was taking away from their responsibility to their home, their family, their husband, their children, and their, reading of the Bible. The Black women did not have those same hang-ups and didn't have a problem with creating an actual book club for reading and discussing these books. The author suggests that this difference may reflect the historic importance of literacy in the Black community. Elizabeth McHenry, who examines 19th century African American literary societies in her monograph Forgotten Readers, chronicles how such societies were established to promote literacy and to ensure that as a group they would not be excluded from the benefits associated with reading and literary study. Perhaps this book club also signals the differences between Black and white evangelicals on the concepts of gender or leisure. Granted, this also happened as Oprah's book club was beginning, and so it's possible that some of this could have been tied to cultural changes. It's also striking that the leader of this book club had a husband who supported her reading of these books and her formation of the club, which again was not often evidenced amongst the white women readers of the genre. The conversations that were had at this book club were also strikingly different from the types of conversations with white women that she interviewed. She says, "Unlike my other interviewees, the members of this book club discussed racism, an issue they faced. Mona, a nurse, described the similarity between her work and that described in the novel that they were discussing for that month. She said, "I work with a lot of Caucasian people, and when they make certain remarks on things due to the fact that I'm African American, I catch them real quick and I'm like, that's unacceptable." The group had only read a few African American Christian romances and seemed unfamiliar with its white counterparts. She goes on to say that these women seemed to exert more power over their leisure time. They met regularly and didn't have to steal time or use the language of compulsion, which again is quite different from the white women reading the genre. One other thing that I want to talk about in this section of the video, talking about Black women readers of evangelical romances, is something that I think is really important to a later part of this conversation that is linking the way that many of the novels for white women were upholding colonial ideas and in many ways supporting a paternalistic version of white supremacy. And again, this I think is really important. One issue that these Black women readers faced was there just weren't that many books being published by Black authors in this space, as opposed to the many books by white authors being published. Have things dramatically changed? Maybe not. I think like indie publishing maybe has begun to change things a little bit, but I think this is probably continuing to be an issue. For some of the African American women who I interviewed, the obstacles for them in these books were greater. They struggled with a spiritual issue facing all aspects of evangelicalism, including its novels: racism. These readers confronted a genre dominated by white authors and characters, a dominance overlooked by most of the white women I interviewed. Again, like how much of this has changed? Hopefully some of it is starting to. This lack of diversity creates a problem for women who are interested in reading only African American evangelical romance, the problem of finding enough books to read. For African American women who read evangelical romances by white authors that feature white characters, different struggles emerged. As I talked with Tamara, a 36-year-old African American, about the novels in the library where she worked, she raised questions and concerns about race in the novels. She asked, "Why does everybody have to be 6'4" with blue eyes, you know?" The physical perfection and lack of diversity eventually affected her reading choices. "I used to be really into the more historical ones because Lori Wick used to do those historical ones, but after a while, I just got tired of the tall, good-looking guys with blue eyes. Sometimes you get tired of it because it does something to your mind after a while. I know my child will be reading this type of literature at about 12 or 13, and she'll get tired of those things, and what will that do to my child's brain?" Troubled by images of flawless white beauty, Tamara struggled to find heroines that reflected her experiences as an African American woman. Another woman she interviewed said, "You can literally count on one hand how many books have Black people on the cover if you're in a Christian bookstore." Again, this is still a problem more broadly in publishing, but especially within evangelical Christianity, there remains a very large divide between Black evangelical churches and white evangelical churches, what they believe, what they advocate for politically, and, you know, I think we begin to see some of the reasons why as we dive more into the side of white women reading evangelical romances. One other thing to mention about the demographics of these readers is that while in fact the average reader was not a teenager, was a woman who was married and well into her 30s or 40s, this was not exclusively who was reading these books. And so while there's a quote in here from Lori Wick, an author I'm going to be mentioning again in this video, saying, "I don't write these for young people," the reality is young people were reading her books. I certainly was, and the impact that some of the content of these books might have on younger readers is different from somebody who maybe is married and is in a different part of their life. That said, there were some of these books written with teenagers in mind, and there is one specific series we are going to be mentioning. But first, let's talk a little bit about the history of evangelical romance. Romancing God traces the origins of evangelical romance all the way back to the early 1900s and Grace Livingston Hill. She was a novelist who wrote romances with Christian characters and was the first person to really start to make this genre a thing. She was very popular. She was a bestseller. A lot of the men at the time had some questions and issues with what she was doing, especially because this is with the rise of muscular Christianity, which I talked about in part 1 of this series. Nevertheless, nevertheless, she was a bestseller, she was a prolific writer, and she kind of paved the way for this genre. The next instance we get is in 1967, where Catherine Marshall published Christie. And it's interesting, I didn't realize this book came out in 1967. This is a book that I did read as a teenager, probably because there was a movie and then television show that came out when I was a teenager and growing up, and so this was really relevant. But this one was a historical novel about a woman torn between two men. Again, it was very spiritual. It was glamorizing the Western movement of European settlers from Europe in the United States, and it was also wildly popular, a big bestseller. Then in 1972, we saw the publishing of what began the romance genre, the secular romance genre as we know it today. This was with the publishing of The Flame and the Flower by Kathleen Woodiwiss. This is not a book that I have read, but it was sexy, it was kind of a bodice ripper, and this began the publishing of many more of these kinds of overtly sexual romance novels marketed to women. And this is the 1970s, so we've got early waves of feminism happening. We've got all of these movements happening socially that are in opposition to the beliefs of conservative evangelical Christian women. And so in response, of course, we have Jeanette Oki deciding that she is going to publish a book that she would feel comfortable reading. She's having trouble finding anything on the shelves that she thinks is appropriate, so she decides to just do it herself. And in 1979, she publishes Love Comes Softly, a historical Christian romance that is seen as the real start to what we now know as this subgenre of inspirational Christian romance. Jeanette Oki had always been interested in the settlement of the West and was impressed by the, quote, deep religious faith of its early settlers. Oki wove this history into the novel. Like Grace Livingston Hill, she combined evangelical Christianity, the Western prairie, and a romantic plot. She wrote of the love between Marty and Clark, a story that contained an evangelical message as faithful Christian Clark shared the gospel with and prayed for his wife, heroine Marty. Her eventual conversion demonstrated the steps to salvation and fulfills, like Hill's earlier work, evangelical aesthetic demands for witnessing. To date, Oki has written over 24 books and sold over 16 million copies. Just as Kathleen Woodiwiss revolutionized the secular romance novel industry, Jeanette Oki transformed the landscape of Christian fiction as she inaugurated the contemporary form of evangelical romance. This ended up turning into an entire series of books that followed those characters, their children, and their grandchildren, and also launched many Christian romances getting published because publishers started to realize that it could be quite lucrative for them. Throughout the 80s, we started to see a rise of more and more of these novels getting published by Christian publishing houses and then eventually by regular publishing houses. In fact, the religious book publishing industry saw a 6.3% increase in sales between 1987 and 1996, a 4% increase between 97 and 98, and another 3.3% increase in 1999. While the growth rate may have slowed during the 1990s, the industry continues to do well. This was written again in 2006. In 1994, coinciding with the advent of the Christie television series, consumers, okay, so that's when it was, 1994, I definitely saw that. Consumers purchased over 1 million copies of the reprinted novel. She goes on to talk about some other heavy hitters as we move forward in time into the 90s and the early 2000s. 1997 saw the success of Francine Rivers' Redeeming Love as readers purchased more than 55,000 copies, and this year we are getting a film adaptation of Redeeming Love, this book that came out then, and we are going to talk about Redeeming Love. It is one of my case studies. We're going to get there. And in 1999, 2 of Lori Wick's novels, Princess and Every Little Thing About You, passed the 100,000 mark. Princess is also going to be a case study. Furthermore, Jeanette Oki, Beverly Lewis, and Lori Wick all had titles among the top 10 best-selling Christian fiction books of the year 2000. Neal goes on to say, not only have the genre's boundaries expanded, but other publishers, Christian and secular, are entering this profitable market. For example, Harlequin, the foremost publisher of secular romance novels, established a new imprint, Steeple Hill, that issues 3 inspirational romances every month under the line title Love Inspired. One thing that I think is really interesting interesting is that Harlequin still has the love-inspired line, although I think it is less overtly religious now than it used to be, or less often overtly religious, but it is still part of this inspirational romance category, and we're going to talk about some of the highlights of that. Random House established an inspirational fiction division named Waterbrook Press, which publishes evangelical romance and Christian fiction, and in 1988, HarperCollins bought Zondervan, a Christian publisher established in the 1930s. So the market has just continued to expand since then. Like I said, I was coming of age in the 90s and early aughts. I graduated from high school in 2004 and was reading these books throughout my early teen years. And so they were pretty formative for me and formative for my ideas of romance and the role of women. And that ends up becoming kind of a problem. So I've been talking about this separation between Christian romance and secular romance. What exactly does that mean? What are the hallmarks of Christian versus secular romances? Well, there's a few parts to this. One of them is obviously sex. In a Christian romance novel, you are not going to have explicitly described on-page sex scenes in the ways that you might in some secular romance novels, although not all. There are also closed-door or fade-to-black romances that aren't overtly religious, but that is definitely a big part of it, and a lot of these women talked about how they didn't want to see that on page. They tend to be more chaste, although there's variation in that. Some of them might have just a small kiss. Some of them might actually show temptation of a character kind of getting hot and bothered and having to step away, but you're never going to get explicit on-page sex. They also are going to have these overtly spiritual themes, like I mentioned earlier, where there are obstacles to overcome, spiritual growth and reconnection with God has to happen for this romance to take place. And also they would support these conservative evangelical worldviews. According to the book, confronted with the crises of homosexuality, promiscuity, and serial monogamy, these evangelical women see the genre as a way to redeem romance and at the same time combat the world's distortions. In their view, the world has reduced romance to sex and divorced sex from marriage. If things were functioning the way God intended them to be, Melody, a 30-year-old married mother of two, told me, there wouldn't be all this dating, break up, date somebody else, get married, divorced, marry somebody else. Echoing Melody's charge, Gale stated that time has perverted it, obviously in our society. Naming sex as the biggest difference between the two genres, my readers indicted the secular and endorsed the evangelical. Quote, worldly romances promote relationships based on casual sex rather than enduring commitment and shared beliefs. Charisse explained it this way. In secular books, it's like sex, lust, and everything, but in Ain't No River by Sharon Elwell Foster, it's like, I want to get to know you. Let's get to know God together. Lila offered a similar assessment. In a lot of those secular novels, they fall instantly in love and indulge in their passion, and they might get married or hang out for a little while, and that's usually the end of the book. And that is not life. Life continues after you get married. That is the test of the relationship. It's much harder than the falling in love. That part is easy. So those are some of the differences and some of the ideas that they have behind it. The author also references a landmark literary study of the romance genre, Reading the Romance by Janice Radway, and this I thought was interesting. Radway gives a careful and balanced interpretation of romance reading, but concludes that the women who seek out ideal novels in order to construct such a vision again and again are reading not out of contentment, but out of dissatisfaction, longing, and protest. She goes on to suggest that reading itself may be cathartic, but it is tempting to suggest that romantic fiction must be an active agent in the maintenance of the ideological status quo, because it ultimately reconciles women to patriarchal society and reintegrates them with its institutions. Now, the author pushes back a little bit on this perspective, but I do think that it's interesting, this idea of some romances reintegrating women into patriarchal institutions, because I do think the evangelical romance novels in many ways do that. They serve to reify beliefs about the role of women, about who God is and his relationship to them, and their place in the world. And that is not always a positive thing, because it often reinforces heavily misogynistic, patriarchal ideas and ideas that end up lending themselves to making it easy for abusers to get away with things. These books end up becoming a way for women to negotiate and reinforce gender roles. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these women, particularly white evangelical women, felt like they had to steal time away for themselves. And this is definitely language I remember hearing, and I think that we still hear from women in general. But it's interesting because I do feel like it maybe is a very American thing coming from this puritanical history that we have and the sort of work ethic that goes along with it. She did an interview with a woman named Charlotte, who is a mother and a reader of these, and Charlotte framed her reading practice as, quote, wholesome entertainment, a small way to strengthen her faith and claim some fun. I think it is honoring to God to pick that as a form of recreation because I think it is pleasing to him because it has scriptures. It is clean. There are so many other books that you have to either skim over something or you might read it and wish you hadn't and it might stick in your mind. I think it is a godly way of self-entertainment. I think the Bible says to think on these things, whatever is pure. When you are reading to me, when I read something, it really stays with me. Charlotte seamlessly combines entertainment and God in a way that reveals the pervasiveness of evangelical ideas about sacralizing all of life. And I think that that is very much an evangelical idea, that the sacred should be a part of every element of your life. And indeed, as she says in the book, concerns about the idleness associated with leisure pursuits are further enhanced by evangelical views of the millennium of the second coming of Christ. The imminent return of Jesus demands that Christians make every minute count for eternity. All choices matter, and with heaven and hell in the balance, a little light reading can be difficult to justify, especially for women. Studies demonstrate that women indulge in less leisure than men due to lack of time, money, opportunity, and facilities. Additionally, the socialization of women into an ethic of care, or put another way, into, quote, traditional gender roles, prompts women to place others first and to sacrifice their already scarce leisure. This ethic also limits women's leisure choices, usually to activities designated as feminine, including romance novel reading. Given the prescriptive power of these gender roles in evangelicalism, as well as the demands of working both inside and outside the home, the choice to read these novels reflects not only the gender constraints on women's leisure, but also their control over it. And she goes on to talk about how this is a very gendered thing, that men are seen as needing or being allowed more leisure time, even within evangelical circles, in ways that women are not. And so, the language of compulsion provides a way for these women to claim leisure time. It transfers the responsibility for their behavior from the self to the story. In the logic of this rationale, the novels exert power over the readers and demand that they take time to read. Portraying themselves as passive before the power of the narrative in this context, they diminish the significance of their own power, their control over leisure, and thereby ward off criticism from the self or from others of their reading. Examples of this are, I couldn't put it down, or I just couldn't help myself to read. And so it's interesting that this language of like compulsion is what ends up letting them take this leisure time for themselves. And, you know, this isn't a thing that we just see amongst Christians. There's this talk of like a guilty pleasure TV show, for instance, or like I stayed up all night reading and I couldn't help myself. Like this is the kind of language that we hear a lot of people use. But what's interesting is that it is frequently used by women, more predominantly, not only by women, but predominantly by women. And I think that does say a lot about the expectations placed on women and the fact that so many women feel guilty for taking time for themselves. In the book, she talks about mothers sharing these books with their teenage daughters because they hope to give them the same values that they hold themselves. For mothers, evangelical romance novels disciplined their daughters to choose Christian forms of entertainment, particularly a literary formula that emphasizes the virtue of chastity prior to marriage and the necessity of a Christian spouse. In this religious rearing, mothers not only teach their daughters how to read as children, but guide them in what to read as teenagers. I was always a really big reader, more so even than my parents were. So for me, I know that some of the early books that I picked up were probably because I saw my mom reading them. I know my mom read some of the Jeanette Okie books. She ended up tending to read things that were more historical, less heavy on the romance than what I ended up finding. So I think on my own and with friends, I discovered like Lori Wick. We would read and pass those around quite a lot, which in hindsight is, you know, maybe less than ideal. But these books definitely do promote a specific idea of gender, of relationships, of women's roles, and of femininity. In many cases, it ties into purity culture, which is a topic I'm going to explore more thoroughly in part 3 of this video series, so don't worry, that will be coming. But often it ties into purity culture through ideas about chastity, about modesty, and also I think because in these books, it's so focused on the sacred romance as well, which we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into that. But because it's focused on this sacred romance with God in this like very close, personal, almost romantic relationship, you end up having the hero being almost a stand-in for Jesus and being what an actual regular man with flaws is never going to be, because like your husband isn't and cannot be Jesus to you. I'm going to talk about some specific case studies and talk a little bit more about this idea of the sacred romance. Part of what is informing these conversations is a project that I did several years ago, and I'll link it up above if you want to see it. But I decided, because I hadn't gone back in, 10, 15 years to read some of these evangelical romances I remembered loving as a teenager, I decided, wouldn't it be interesting to track down some of the ones I remember loving and read them again as like a, 30-some-year-old woman who's married with children and vlog the experience and see how it goes. It did not go well. It was a very interesting experience. So if you want to see that, I can link that video up above. It's from several years ago, so, excuse any quality issues, but I think the conversations are really interesting. And I think in going back and rereading them, it illuminated to me how harmful a lot of the ideas perpetuated by these books that I read and loved and reread over and over again as a young person really were. Often, if you had a heroine who was something less than perfect, she was rebellious or sexual or whatever, her character arc was towards being sweet and nice and like the perfect example of quiet femininity. And, I think one thing that has really struck me over the years is how different this idealized vision of evangelical Christian womanhood is from, the women who are actual heroines in the biblical text. I just find it so interesting that these are the heroines who we have in fiction, but if the Bible is your sacred text and you look at the women who are sort of lauded, we have people like Jael, who seduced an enemy general and then killed him in his sleep afterwards. We have Rahab, who was a prostitute who lied and hid spies. We just have a lot of women who were sex workers, who were bold, who, took these roles and had this version of femininity that is not at all the type of femininity and the type of Christian womanhood that you see represented in a lot of these novels that are reinforcing these heavily misogynist patriarchal ideas in a way that normalizes it for readers. And, maybe for women who were already married reading it, it helped them feel more okay about the lives they were living. And, I'm sure maybe did some harm there as well, but especially I think for teenagers reading it, it can create these really harmful patterns. And sometimes you would even get books that had grooming in them of older men and younger women that was normalized. You had this really controlling behavior that was normalized. And, not that there isn't controlling behavior in other kinds of romances as well, but often these women just really lack agency. And part of the problem is because it is so meant to closely parallel a relationship with God and the idealized version of what that should look like. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But first, I want to talk about a book. My kids just got back home, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. I did not anticipate it taking so long for me to get through all of my notes on this section. So what I'm going to do is divide this up into 2 parts. I will be back with part 2 of this inspirational romance discussion where we're going to talk about specific book case studies, this idea of sacred romance, and the ways that white evangelical romances in the past and still today, unfortunately, have had a hand in propping up colonizer narratives, paternalism, and white supremacy. Stay tuned, it's not going to be nearly as long in between parts for this because I do already have my notes. I have just run out of time to finish filming this because this has taken a lot longer than I thought it was going to. So hopefully this was interesting and gave you a little bit of a look at what inspirational romance is, the history of inspirational romance, and what features about it separate it from secular romance. Talk to me in the comments down below and let me know any of your thoughts. I would be really interested to know what surprised you about this. Was there anything that you found really surprising or that you weren't aware of? Personally, reading Romancing God, I found really fascinating. Some of it was things that I already knew. Some of it was things that I wasn't aware of. And for me, I think reading through this, thinking through this material has really helped me better pinpoint some things about my own history and issues that I'm personally grappling with in terms of spirituality and where I stand with all of that. I know it's complicated and it's messy and it's hard, and that's part of why I want to talk about it. It's not necessarily easy, but I know it can be helpful, and I really appreciate the comments from so many of you on the first installment in this series, sharing how much it meant, sharing your own experiences, sharing how lonely it can sometimes be when you're on this kind of a journey. I think it really can be, and it is, and I hope that these videos help you in your process the way that they're helping me in mine. Talk to me in the comments down below. If you liked this video, it does help if you give it a thumbs up, and subscribe and click that notification bell if you want to see more and be notified when part 2 releases, because part 2 of Inspirational Romance will be coming very soon. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.